General sample norms are more valuable for diagnostic purposes than subgroup norms. So whether you use the DSM-5 or whether you use the ICD system for making clinical diagnoses of child psychopathology, the general sample norms are most consistent with those diagnostic systems. We, in 1992, decided to break with tradition and have separate gender norms for boys and girls, but also create a general sample norm. We did that because in other areas of child assessment, gender is not relevant to making the diagnostic decision. So, for example, the decision you make in the DSM-5 about ADHD is, does this child have ADHD? The decision is not, does this child have ADHD compared only to boys or compared only to girls? So the diagnostic decision is basically gender blind or gender neutral. And this is why we created the general sample norms. Here's another interesting point, however. What we also need to be aware of is that when you use gender norms, male, female norms, boy, girl norms, on a rating scale, it erases the gender differences. So if you think that boys and girls have the same amount of hyperactivity, the same amount of attention problems, the same amount of depression, the same amount of social skills, if you think boys and girls are equal, then use the separate gender norms. Use the separate male-female norms. So what will happen is if you use the gender norms or the sex norms when diagnosing ADHD, is because it erases the gender differences, you'll diagnose the same proportion of children in the population with ADHD, whether they're boys or girls. So if the epidemiology, the prevalence of ADHD in the population, let's say, is 5% for boys and 2% for girls, let's say, if you use the separate gender norms, it will be 5% for boys and girls. If you use the general sample norms, it preserves, it keeps the gender differences, and you will diagnose 5% boys and 2% girls. So it depends on what you believe. I will show you some data from various countries to show big differences between boys and girls as perceived by parents and perceived by teachers. But if you think that boys and girls are exactly alike in terms of their behavioral and emotional adjustment, choose the gender norms. We recommend the general sample norms for most diagnostic purposes because that's the most consistent with diagnostic systems which do not take gender, sex into account when making a diagnostic decision. So, long explanation, but it's an important explanation because it's counterintuitive. I've talked to many psychologists over the years that think that the gender norms preserve the gender differences. It's exactly the opposite. So it's quite counterintuitive.